Well, hey there, sugar. Are you here for a reading? Why don't you sit yourself down? I will read you your 7-card progression. Past, present, and future. Well, we are starting off with the Hanged Man. You have had a bit of a shock in your not-so-distant past. Something about yourself that you have had to come to terms with. Something about yourself that was causing you problems. Now the past is the past, over and done, but let's see how you saw yourself. The Empress. She represents fertility, generosity, and productivity. I don't know if I expected that, but I think that perhaps you saw yourself as a creative type. Well, that certainly explains a thing or two. Now let's see what you got learned along the way. Now this makes sense. The Hierophant. Usually this card is all about following the rules, but I don't think you are the type to do that. Rather, I think that you learned that you don't like the rules. I think maybe you came up with your own code of conduct from here on in. Can't say I blame you. Now that takes us all the way up to the present. The Star. Whatever it was you learned along the way, it's working for you. You can't stay in this reprieve forever, but right now, enjoy the tranquility before the next challenges come along. Okay, so obviously I planned this out ahead of time. Besides the fact that I'm only picking major arcana, which I literally don't know the tarot deck well enough to do a reading with random cards on camera, but that's entirely beside the point I'm making. Here's the thing, stories are incredibly compelling, and it's one of the reasons we like history so much. Whether it's biography, or a war story, or a survival story, or a travel story, we like the idea that we can connect with these people who lived incredible lives a long time ago, who really lived and really did these incredible things. And collectively, just about everyone likes narrative of one kind or another, and people who like history are no exception. But here's the thing. These narratives, even historical narratives, are almost entirely false. But how could the facts of history be as random as tarot cards? We have written records, testimonies. It's anything but random. I'm reminded of one of my favorite TV shows of all time, Bacano. The framing device of the story is that newspaper scraps spanning 3 years were all shuffled together, and while you knew that they had something to do with each other, the connections weren't immediately evident. The result of this kind of storytelling is very disjointed and hard to parse on the first pass through. Even after putting the stories in order and figuring out what happened when in the story, and this takes a fine-tooth comb approach to make sure that nothing gets lost along the way, you still have to ask yourself, why was this story written in the first place? It's a fascinating piece of media, and I can't recommend it enough, but it also models how historians do their work. You might start off with an archive full of materials, or a community that wants to tell its story, or some really interesting business records, but it's your job to figure out how it all fits together, and to figure out why it matters, and to find an audience, and how to write the story for that audience. And that's a lot of pressure. How willing are you to connect those dots? How many guesses are you willing to take? And what's the line between an incredible connection and one that strains credibility? I don't have any perfect answers to this, but it's worth keeping in mind that, 1, even if we have all the information available, we don't have all the information that was ever available. 2, it's hard to know which pieces of information were most important to the subject and to the people who were impacted by the subject. And 3, we're only ever guessing at what's going on in other people's heads. Theory of mind is the psychological theory that we can read each other's minds. A little. Okay, not really. But it is the theory that starting around the age of 4 or so, we understand that what other people are thinking might be different from what we're thinking, especially if they've been given a different set of information. In fact, there's a pretty simple experiment that you can do at home to figure out if your kid has developed theory of mind or not. If you show a kid a box, they're going to assume that what is on the inside is what's advertised on the outside. But if you show them that actually what's in there is my USB to wall port converter, they're going to know that that's what's actually in here. Theory of mind comes in when you show the box to a third person who's just come in. If the 4-year-old has developed theory of mind, they will know that that third person is going to assume that this is the universal weight tarot deck rather than my phone charger. But if they haven't developed theory of mind, they're going to assume that this third person has all the same information that they do, even though they haven't seen inside the box and have no way of knowing that it's anything but the universal weight tarot deck. But while this can be useful for figuring out where your kid is in their developmental psychology, there are some limitations to theory of mind. Say, for example, you've made the mistake of bickering with a teenager. Suddenly, he goes quiet and refuses to engage with you. This ticks you off because you think that he's being sullen and incommunicative. But what if in his mind he's afraid to stand up for himself or self-advocate because he's afraid of coming off as defensive or bratty? Both of these explanations are plausible, but more importantly, they reveal the limitations of theory of mind. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't still some instances where it can work. The shorter the time frame or the distance and the closer and stronger the relationship are, the better theory of mind is going to work. But trying to figure out what was going on in Napoleon's head 200 years ago? Well, based on the sweeping documentary, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, we know that he liked water slides and ice cream sundaes. Yeah, it's not going to happen. You've never met the guy, you probably have few life experiences in common, and if you're watching this video, you probably don't even speak the same language.
Unless of course you do, Shari, in which case like and subscribe, oui, baguette,
So we're going to need something a little bit stronger than theory of mind, biography, and narrative history. How about cognitive science? Now, I know Cass Arris, which, if you don't know her work, she's a fairly small YouTuber who does psychology content. I'll link her below. But I did take a couple of psychology classes, and I know how to research. But since I am less confident in neuroscience than history, you might want to check out my sources below. There are two systems which makes the process of storytelling and story listening enjoyable and even addicting. The first is the release of oxytocin, which will boost your feelings of trust, compassion, and empathy, and moves you towards more pro-social behaviors. The second is called neural mirroring. Essentially, when you have really strong communication with someone, the listener's brain activity mirrors what's going on in the storyteller's, and they feel like they've had a set of experiences that the other person is trying to convey to them. Both of these systems promote individual and species-wide interest in stories and storytelling. We're drawn to narrative because we like to empathize with the main characters, and there's something special about history because we know these people really existed. But we also now know that so much of that sticky narrative goo that holds the history together is editorializing on the part of the historian. We are actually psychologically primed to look for narrative in the same way that we're primed to look for faces in non-face objects. We're looking for patterns. We want to make order out of chaos, sense out of senselessness, even if it's just as random as the cards from a tarot deck. Why else would you have a new biography on George Washington for every generation? Why would it be necessary? Except for the fact that the writer and the audience are just as much characters in the telling of a narrative history as are the historical figures themselves. Once you realize that, you see that narrative history is the attempt at a narrative-focused mind to make sense of all of these disparate pieces. One example that I've already talked about on this channel is Ron Chernow's Grant. So, Ron Chernow does this thing where he starts with all of the data, all of the information you could possibly want, which is how you should start your historical research. But then he takes that information and he narrativizes a hero based on this historical figure. And this is a problem because people don't live their lives in a convenient 3-act structure. You know, in order to have a hero, you have to have certain problems for them to overcome internally, externally, great accomplishments, whatever. People don't live their lives that way. This is storytelling. It's compelling storytelling. I have enjoyed his work before. It's not the best histories, and here is where you start to see the problems. When you narrativize someone's life, opposed to just cataloging it, you end up with inconsistencies. Now, I'm not saying that Ron Chernow massages data or anything so overt. What I am saying is that he tends to take a narrative, and any piece of data that falls outside of that narrative, he will either dismiss it or say it's a one-off thing. He doesn't attribute it to the person's character. I first noticed this when I was reading Grant. Now, throughout Grant's career, drinking was a problem for him to different extents, at different times. Sometimes it was a problem because it was a problem for him. Sometimes other people made it a problem for him, either by slandering him or by exposing his drinking, or however you want to look at it. A lot of this is he said, and you just don't know. But what Ron Chernow does is he narrativizes, like, Grant would drink when he had these specific stressors and these specific instances. And then anything that falls out of this narrative, he dismisses as, oh, that was gossip, oh, that was hearsay, someone was slandering him, someone was trying to drag his reputation. It couldn't have been the case. And I don't really see any stronger or weaker evidence that this secondary pattern of behavior wasn't also true. I am not saying that it also wasn't false. I don't know. And more importantly, Ron Chernow doesn't know either. But for a non-biography example, let's take a look at The Cheese and the Worms. This book is a microhistory, or a history that contains just one case study. Most histories, both monograph and article, tend to be made up of case studies, which build to support a thesis. But microhistories are drawn from just one case study, of somebody whose life was so richly documented that historical knowledge can be drawn from just one individual. Now, this stands in contrast to biography, which exists to spread information about the life of one already well-known individual. The Cheese and the Worms documents one town mayor's experience with the Spanish Inquisition. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. And while most of it's very well documented, there are moments when the author veers into speculative fiction. One moment that stands out to me is the assertion that the mayor may have gotten his hands on the Quran at one point, which he may have. You can't disprove a negative. The first time I read this book as an undergrad, I thought this was brilliant that you could connect the dots this way. It was only in a reread that I realized that he had connected the dots with chewing gum and paper clips. The thing is, the more narrative your history is, the more you're going to rely on storytelling rather than historical analysis. And there's also a chance that people won't notice because they're too busy enjoying the story to care. So why does this matter? Are they good, bad? Do we need more of them, less? It's really not as simple as that. The fact is that narrative histories are very popular and they get people interested in the field. Narrative history is an entire tourist industry, and even academic historians use narrative history in case studies and microhistories. The sticking point isn't with it existing, but rather the fact that sometimes we confuse biography and narrative history with academic history from which we can derive real knowledge. I'm not here to say that Ron Chernow's work is bad or not worth reading. I am here to say that it contains just as much editorializing as historical knowledge. Rather, it's the analysis-based histories that bear the real fruits that this field has to offer. Reading the biography of a president and calling it history is a little bit like reading the story of a scientific expedition and assuming that you know paleontology now. It's probably both a good read and an informative story, but it would be false to assume that you know more about science for having read it. For the real knowledge, you'd probably want to go read their peer-reviewed articles. Now, the problem with that is that most academic histories are really dry, and I wouldn't recommend picking up a copy of The History of the English Working Class unless you are really into dry academic texts from the 1960s. Seriously, it's like there were a couple decades there where historians just forgot how to write an engaging text. But I can give you a couple of recommendations, and who knows, maybe one of them will be your thing. So the first one that I recommend is Drew Faust's This Republic of Suffering, which is about the emotional experience of fighting in the Civil War, with a special focus on death and dying. The second one, Daniel Richer's Facing East from Indian Company, which tells early American history from the point of Native Americans. And the third is Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, which is a philosophical look at the history of prisons. Notice how none of them are about just one guy, and they all promise to be systemic in their approach.
These are a couple of things to look for when looking for an academic history rather than a popular one. It's not all about footnotes, although that's usually a good indicator too. Be on the lookout for thesis statements about how the world works and why society is set up the way it is, as well as methodical approaches to prove these statements true. These books are arguments, not chronicles, and while they might not have a plot, they have something even more important, a point. But just for fun, let's see what the future holds. Now let's see what your upcoming influences are going to be. Well, temperate. You are going to find it handy to have a go-with-the-flow attitude in what's coming up next. That is probably a good thing, considering where you've been lately. Just take a deep breath and realize that you are going to deal with everything you need to and not a single thing more. Those influences are going to affect you. Justice. Make sure that while you are learning how to go with the flow that you don't get blown too far off course. Justice is all about making sure that your actions align with your beliefs. But I don't think that'll be too difficult for you. And the final outcome, the Fool. Oh, don't take it so hard. The Fool is all about fresh starts. You got lucky this time. But don't forget everything you learned along the way.